And now in our discussion, Africa has been engulfed with conflict, violence and court changes. All are alleged to be related to corruption and undermining of the ethical leadership and violent reaction. Now, Africa seems to be losing moral fibre and also losing ubuntu. Africa seems to be undermining the ethics and values of constitutionality, leading to violence and instability post-elections, as is the case in Zimbabwe as well as Mali. And now joining us in studio to further discuss this issue, we have Father Smangaliso Mkajwa, the chair of the Moral Regeneration Movement, and we are still joined by Chadia Tapiwa Diamond, Afro expert. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Good evening.
So I'm going to start with you, Father. How are the leaders in Africa incorporating values in leadership?
There are various ways to incorporate, inculcate values. First of all, the role of the family. All of us, were born in a particular family, not only in the nuclear sense, but also including, more extended family, the environment, the neighborhood, and so on, family in that sense. The religious organizations also have a very important role to play through the various teachings, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or other sacred books and so on. And they also try to influence the behavior, the conduct of people. So therefore there's a relationship between what goes on in the families and what goes on in your religious organizations. I also then want to use a more generic term and talk about the influence of social organizations, which would include your churches, your schools, your universities, your institutions of learning of various types and so on, and other institutes and institutions whose main task is to deal with the behavior, the conduct of people in society. Now, the Moral Regeneration Movement, therefore, has a very close relationship with those social organizations whose main task is also to try and ensure that we have a country that is ethically and morally healthy. And I'm sure lots of people will agree that when Mandela called for the RDP of the soul, he knew exactly what he was talking about, because over the past few years, you can also see the consequences of sometimes ignoring or not taking very seriously that call, and therefore the ethical values, that it results therefore in instances of violence, of conflict, of corruption, and all the social pathologies.
And looking at the behavior as well as the conduct of leaders in the countries, looking at how they influence the countries, what do you make of that so far, looking across the African continent with the violence that we've seen escalate?
Leaders, especially those in the public domain, have a very critical responsibility in the sense that the average person sees leaders every day. They hear them giving speeches, giving directives, and so on. They see them the way they even conduct themselves privately and publicly, and so on. And therefore, particularly for young people, they become the public role models for them, which therefore means that leaders have a critical responsibility in terms of building a society that is based on ethical values. Now, unfortunately, let me talk about Africa, not so much about Europe and Trump and all these other people and so on. This is our home, that's our family we're concerned about. Professor Masrui, who's, it's passed on and so on, he made a very interesting observation. He said, many of the African leaders, even those that are democratically elected and so on, there's a way in which they are still steeped or have one foot in the traditional style of leadership. They almost unconsciously see themselves and behave as chiefs, And therefore, which means they must be seen to have a lot of property, a lot of money, a lot of everything that looks good, you know, to society and so on, which makes them appear that they've got power and they exercise that power, and sometimes not always in a very responsible way. So that's why, therefore, you can understand that because politics is a quest for power and influence, it becomes very difficult for some of them, when their term of office expires, to gracefully, you know, give way to the next. It's almost human, you know, it's understandable, but it's causing lots of problems, you know, for Africa's development, you know, as a whole.
Diamond, looking at power being an influence in some of these countries, whereas at the end of the day it leads to violence as well. What do you make of power in terms of looking at it with incorporating moral values in leadership?
Well, I think first and foremost what is critical to understand is that we as Africans, we have got our own tradition with our own culture, like what my father here was saying, that as a king, as a father, the value of a king is seen in his wealth.
Yeah.
So the more you amass wealth, that's the more value, that's the more powerful you become. But now, remember that in Africa, we have now introduced Western theories, Western ideologies into Africa. So now there's a conflict. Because in our African tradition, for instance, as an example, we said the husband is the one who is the head.
Yeah.
But now, in the new modern world, it says we speak of equal rights. So that automatically brings a conflict. If you also look at the issue of elections, the issue of elections, it brings in winners and it brings in losers at the very same time. It's majority versus the minority. Then the ones who are the majority now have got more, enjoy the benefits as compared to the minority. That was not part and parcel of the African system. So with this new introduction now of these norms and values, what we perceive to be the best, these are things which the capital, the Western world, is instilling into Africa. And as a result, I believe Africa is struggling to come to standards, to come to the level of the Western principles and theories, because the resources that we have and the type of families and the type of setup and the politics that we have in Africa are different. So it brings in then conflict. That is where we now, even in politics, those who have power, those who are in control of this all areas of accumulating wealth, they then tend to suppress those without, because they still want to maintain and have more and acquire more wealth. So any attempts for anyone to put their hands into the cookie jar, any attempt from any other outside parties like opposition parties would then come in and try and take that space, there'll be violence. We'll give an example. If we've seen what has been happening in DRC, President Kabila has been there since about 2001. He does not want to leave power because of the diamonds. There is also oil involved. If you look at a country like Zimbabwe, which is also in SADC, there's been the world's biggest diamond field in Africa. $15 billion went missing. The leaders took the money for themselves. They did not share with the community. There was no development to the community. They just amassed that wealth themselves. When opposition parties come and contest that space, any attempts or any signs of them losing power, it will lead to bloodshed.
Father Mkacha, I'd say that with power comes corruption, and it seems as if leadership accountability in Africa has been an issue for most countries. We have seen a lot of the officials in government getting away with murder and corruption. How can we hold the government to be accountable?
First of all, just to make one or two comments on the statement made by my brother here. During those days when we still had a stable African society with its culture, its values, and so on and so on, the role of the chiefs was very clearly defined. They were there to serve the interests of the people. That's why even if a chief had many cattle, but it was always understood that he had those cattle, the land, on behalf, using it on behalf of the people, for the benefit of the people and so on. Now, in contrast to that, We have a new poison, I really call it a cancer, of materialism, where now, through the Western European culture, your leadership begins to feel that materialism is most important. Material goods and things, material power, are probably most important for them. It makes them great, wonderful, and everything else and so on. And that's why sometimes they will even go to an extent of wasting a lot of resources that should be benefiting the people for themselves, their close families, their old cronies and friends and so on. Which therefore means that the task that is facing Africa as a whole, especially via the AU, is for Africa to be able to say, let's take one step back. God has given us so many resources, natural resources. In fact, we should be the richest country in the world, and so on and so on. But because of our narrow understanding of leadership, which has become very selfish, inward-looking, and so on, we are not able to convert those resources for the benefit of the majority of the people. So if only that gospel could go out to them in that, but in the strongest possible way, I think there would be a big difference. Just to also say that when the moral regeneration movement talks about ethics, we're not talking about pie in the sky. You know, talking about the next world or something like that. Those of us, all right, I'm a believer myself, so that is very important for me and so on. But if you read the Charter of Positive Values, these values speak to the concrete lives and experiences of the people, about poverty, human dignity. It's talking about the rule of law and democracy and so on. It's talking about material well-being and economic well-being, you know, of the people and so on. It's talking about culture, family values, and what have you. So in other words, we're looking for those kind of values that are shared. As a Catholic, I'm a Catholic priest myself. There are certain values that are specifically Catholic. That's fine. But here we're talking about those values that cut across culture, language, race, and so on. That in fact should act as a glue to bring about social cohesion in our relationships, irrespective of whatever country or tribe or group, ethnic group you belong to. Those are it seems to me, the values that needs to be at the basis of the operations and the conduct of the AU.
And we know that, Diamond, the AU had declared 2018 as the year of winning the fight against corruption, a sustainable path to Africa's transformation. Has much changed in terms of holding the leadership accountable?
Africa is good in making ideas, it's good in ideas. Africa is very good in having the brains to put ideas on paper and elaborating on those ideas. But when it comes to the implementation of those ideas, Africa has been found wanting. If you look at there was Vision 2020, the Agenda 2063 from the African Union, it speaks, it is rich in information, it is rich in terms of ideas, but these are just pies in the air, like what my learned colleague was saying. No one implements anything in Africa. But I also believe the crisis in terms of implementing those comes in from the fact that if you look at the regional groups that we have, look at SADC would not say anything, would not call any leader, bring them to book. They will not do that. They'll just come and drink tea. That's it. If you look at the African Union, it's a toothless dog. They don't speak. They don't say anything. We then as Africans, because of an issue of class consciousness, we then have to identify ourselves with reports coming from the European Union. Like, for instance, if you look at the elections in Zimbabwe, if you look at what is currently happening in Mali, they are so dependent, and we are so dependent on external people, who is the European Union, to come and give their opinion over our own family issues here in Africa. So it tells you a bigger story to say there is a gap, there is a crisis within Africa we are then not able to deal with our own issues in Africa. So it creates a vacuum. That then means that we are then borrowing other ideologies which are not African. There's no spirit of Ubuntu in democracy. It's a dog-eat-dog world when you speak of democracy, because there are elections. So, but we then have that Ubuntu that we have as Africans. We have that villagehood, that communalhood, that if you see a family without, those with, they'll then share with those without. But that is no longer happening in the new world that we have in Africa.
And Diamond, many a times we have been talking about finding African solutions for Africa instead of asking for solutions from external countries as well. Looking at the solutions that we currently have, can we say that they are African solutions?
If we can't fight corruption, if we can't fight poverty, if people 300 kilometers outside of, 20 kilometers out of Sandton, 5 kilometers out of Sandton, they do not have water. They do not have electricity. They do not have the basics of the needs and human wants. If we fail as Africa to do that, we have the sun in Africa, the solar system, the solar power, but we don't use solar power. We have Western countries where there's no sun, but they're able to convert solar energy for power for themselves. So the issue of having African solutions, it has been there. African solutions to fight poverty, African solutions to fight corruption, but the implementation part, the implementation aspect of it is the one which is missing. No one wants to bring another leader to book. We have seen it in political circles. People have been corrupt, but no one brings them to book. They defend themselves. It then tells you that there's no doctrine of separation of powers. Those who are in charge, especially the ones in ruling parties, the ruling parties, they then influence the judiciary to make decisions on their behalf that benefits themselves. No one has been held accountable for the $15 billion which went missing in Zimbabwe. They called the former president, Robert Mugabe, to come to parliament, but he refused to come. Nothing has happened to him. Those who are corrupt, they still walk free. So it then remains, we remain to see that day when one leader is being brought to book. We have only seen that the leaders who are brought to book in terms of corruption and the abuse of human rights, it's those who are no longer needed by the parties that they belong to. Or they could then sometimes come from the ICC, which is also biased, which does not give a fair encounter to all the gross human rights abuses.
Father Mkacha, I want to also get yours on that one.
If you don't mind. We may get very, very, very frustrated and almost, the whole topic may be sound very gloomy. But the good news, though, is that we also do have, or we have had, some outstanding leaders. Like Julius Nyerere is an example. Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Nelson Mandela, of course, coming near our home, O.R. Oliver Tambo, and so on in various countries. What's the name of that woman in Liberia who is just stand out? She's a great woman. So for me, this is, it shows that there can be some examples of good practice, democratic, and people genuinely that prioritize the good of the nation and so on. And there was a time when, for example, General Obasanjo, Thabo Mbeki, and what is his name from Chisano, there was a crop of some of these fairly outstanding African leaders, and they were beginning to move the AU in a particular direction that was really begin to make Africa, stand up and be taken seriously by the international community. Unfortunately, well, they are no longer there. And the other factor that we cannot run away from, we as African countries are still greatly influenced by our former colonial masters. We have a situation, I was the president of a continental organization and so on, and I could tell you one thing. Sometimes after we had agreed to take a particular action and so on, and its local government practitioners and so on, the Francophone component the following day after speaking to Paris and getting instructions, they would come and completely reject what we had already agreed upon. The Anglophone Africans, if we want to use that term, and so on and so on. And the various, so in a way, the influence, negative influence of our former colonial masters, including, of course, our systems of education, they are not going to make this challenge we're talking about any easier. But for me, I'm confident that at some stage, we'll be able to find our feet. And that's why I'm very hopeful that the younger generation will have learned from us older people, from our mistakes, but also good practices, and then to be able to say, no, Africa must really once again occupy the center stage. Remember, so many centuries ago, the center of civilization was actually centered in Africa before it went to Greece, to Rome, and all these other countries and so on. But somewhere along the way, we lost it, and I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to regain it at some stage, but we have to work for it. Yes.
Now, Daman, we know that when it comes to corruption, a lot of the citizens have said that the only way that the government or the leadership responds is when people take to the streets and they start protesting, which eventually leads to violence. How can that be eradicated, whereby the leadership can start serving the people and actually answering their demands and listening to their issues?
I believe the issue comes when leaders want to be elected in power. They come to the people, they go to the people, and they give false hope to the people. They promise people heaven and earth. Ruling parties, they come and promise, but when it comes to the implementation of those ideas, it's non-existent. In a country across the borders, they were promised jobs, 2.2 million jobs. 5 years down the line, nothing happened to those jobs. You know, they've been promised houses. But if you calculate the number of houses that they've been promised, if you calculate the number of years, for 5 years, it means then the government is supposed to give them 820 houses per day, which is not feasible, which is not possible.
Yeah.
In another country, so there's no money, there's a cash crisis. The government promised to give them money, but there's been no solution. 6 months down the line, that is in Zimbabwe, 6 months down the line, that has not happened. So the promise that people, the ruling parties give to the people are the same reasons why they come back again and say, you had a community-based planning, you had a ward-based planning, and you've got your IDP. So now, you said you're going to resolve issues of service delivery. You promised us a school, you promised us roads, and you promised us clinics, but it's 3 years down the line, there's no clinic. So that is why, due to frustrations, that is why the people take to the streets. And trust me, that is the only language that the political leaders understand. If you go to them, speak to them, they don't react. The very same time that people take to the streets, there'll be a reaction. We have seen currently, it happened with the women when they marched. They got the ear of the president. We have also seen it happening today in Mpumalanga. They have asked to speak directly to the president. It's because of being frustrated. It's because the promises that they were given, they're not being respected. They're not coming to be fulfilled. So I believe there is a need to have that generational consensus, to have the great leaders, like what my learned colleague was saying. We need to have in our communities the Nelson Mandelas, in our community, the Kwame Nkrumahs, who are going to champion the values, the moral values of Africans, who are going to put the needs, the communal needs first before they put their own personal needs first, so that there will be service delivery in communities. Once there is service delivery in communities, there will be peace. Because the people in the communities are the very same people who voted. They're the very same people who are staying in dire straits, who are staying in poor conditions, are the very same people who are poor. But those who are in leadership, they are rich. And half the time, they don't even go and meet and speak to those people in communities. So we need to have leaders who understand that they are there for the people, with the people.
Father Mkhatshwa, has Africa lost its moral fibre looking at how violence escalates before and after elections? Most people were shocked that a peaceful country like Zimbabwe went through violence.
What is very interesting is that in some instances, actually this has happened over a number of years, during the election time, the level of community violence usually goes up. You know, it goes up. Because I want to believe that either people want to send a message to the candidates, to the parties, to say, we're going to give you our votes, but on one condition, that we can trust you, that you are going to keep your word. You must show respect for us. Don't lie to us, and so on. Don't be arrogant. You see, that could be one reason. But the other reason, you see, there are some naughty politicians also who stoke propaganda in order to somehow to outshine, you know, the others, to be seen, to be the ones who are really powerful, who are going to change everything overnight, you see, and so on. But the truth of the matter, that's where the moral generation comes in. It says, yes, you must apply pressure. That's your democratic right. But try as much as possible not to use violence, because violence begets violence, you see, and so on. But also remember that, again, it's a fact of life. Politicians normally respond to pressure. Unless there's no pressure, they play games. Unless you also, as I say, we get the kind of leader who really is committed to the welfare of the people, and so doesn't need to be even to be pressurized or anything of that sort. But lots of the others, they get into position, it's comfortable, and the danger is that they easily...
And at the end, they forget about the people. Unfortunately, Baba, I've run out of time, but it was great having you here in studio and having this discussion with me. That was Father Smangaliso Mkhatshwa, chair of the Moral Regeneration Movement, and we also had Chadia Tapiwa, Diamond Afro expert. Right now, Africa Tonight will take a short break. We'll be back with more news and updates. Stay tuned.